The stone door had been sealed for centuries, yet something inside felt awake. Daniel felt it the moment he stepped into the forgotten chamber beneath the ruined monastery. The air carried a strange heaviness, as if the darkness itself had been waiting for someone to return. His flashlight trembled slightly in his hand, while dust floated through the narrow beam of light. Ancient walls surrounded him, covered with faded carvings that twisted like strange, warning symbols. Every step echoed too loudly, making the silence feel alive. The monastery above had been abandoned for nearly 200 years. Locals claimed the place was cursed, whispering stories about shadows that moved on their own. Daniel never believed those stories until he felt the unsettling cold deep underground. At the far end of the chamber stood a stone altar half buried under rubble. Something about it looked deliberate, almost sacred, yet deeply wrong. Dark stains marked the surface like the ghosts of rituals long forgotten. Resting upon the altar was a thick book, wrapped in brittle leather straps. The cover looked ancient, cracked like old skin stretched over bone. A strange symbol was carved into the front, one that Daniel had never seen in any historical text. His heart beat faster as he carefully removed the straps. The leather snapped apart with a dry, brittle sound that echoed across the chamber. For a moment, Daniel felt like he had broken a lock that should have never been touched. The first page revealed faded writing in a language older than most civilizations. Strange illustrations surrounded the text, depicting twisted figures rising from dark soil. Some of them wore armor, others carried weapons stained with shadow. Daniel quickly realized the manuscript was not simply historical. It described a ceremony, something detailed and deliberate, written with chilling precision. The words seemed less like instructions and more like a warning disguised as knowledge. As he turned the pages, the temperature in the chamber seemed to drop. His breath began to fog faintly in the cold air, despite the warmth outside. It felt as if the deeper he read, the colder the room became. One illustration made his hands freeze completely. It showed a massive battlefield covered in corpses, while robed figures stood in a circle chanting beneath a black sky. From the ground, countless warriors clawed their way back into the world of the living. Daniel's mind raced with disbelief and fascination. If the manuscript was authentic, it described a ritual capable of raising the dead as an army. The final lines hinted that the ceremony had once been attempted, but never fully completed. Then, a faint sound echoed somewhere behind him in the darkness. It was slow and deliberate, like stone scraping against stone. Daniel turned his flashlight toward the empty chamber, suddenly feeling that the manuscript might not have been sleeping alone. The second page of the manuscript carried a warning written in darker ink than the rest. The symbols looked sharper, as if carved with anger instead of patience. Daniel felt a strange unease as his eyes traced the first translated sentence. The warning spoke of a ceremony, forbidden even among ancient cults. It claimed the ritual could awaken warriors bound between death and damnation. The manuscript called them the forgotten soldiers of the abyss. Daniel leaned closer to the page, his pulse quietly rising. Every symbol he translated revealed more disturbing details about the ceremony. It wasn't just a myth or superstition buried in history. That ritual required three things that could never occur by accident. A place where thousands had died violently, a night when the moon vanished from the sky, and the blood of a living soul to awaken the dead. Each requirement felt deliberate, as if designed by something ancient and cruel. Daniel searched through his notes, comparing the symbols with historical records. To his shock, several locations matched the description in the manuscript. One battlefield in particular stood out among the others. Centuries ago, a brutal war had ended in a valley where nearly 10,000 soldiers died in a single night. The bodies were buried hastily beneath the soil, their names lost to time. Locals avoided the valley even now, claiming the ground sometimes whispered after midnight. Daniel tried to dismiss the stories as superstition, yet the manuscript described the valley with disturbing accuracy. It even mentioned the exact shape of the surrounding hills. As he continued translating, the ritual itself began to unfold in terrifying detail. Strange symbols had to be drawn in a circle across the ground. Candles made from black wax were to burn at each point of the circle. The chant, written on the following pages, was far worse. The language was older than anything Daniel had studied before. Even attempting to pronounce the words made his throat tighten uncomfortably. One passage chilled him more than anything else. It explained that the ritual had once been attempted by a secret order centuries ago, but something had gone terribly wrong before the ceremony reached its final stage. The manuscript described how the ground had begun to move beneath the ritual circle. Shapes had clawed their way toward the surface before the ceremony was suddenly stopped. The surviving members of the order sealed the manuscript away to prevent anyone from finishing what they started. Daniel slowly closed the book, but the silence in the chamber now felt different. The idea of the unfinished ritual gnawed at his thoughts like a persistent whisper. Somewhere deep inside his mind, curiosity had already begun to overpower fear. The valley looked lifeless under the fading evening sky. Dead grass stretched across the land like a brittle carpet, whispering whenever the wind passed through it. Daniel stood at the edge of the battlefield, feeling an uneasy weight pressing against his chest. He had traveled for 2 days to reach the place described in the manuscript. Every map and historical record confirmed what had happened here centuries ago. Thousands of soldiers had died violently in this very valley. The hills surrounding the land formed a strange natural circle. Daniel noticed the shape immediately because the manuscript had described it exactly the same way. It felt less like coincidence and more like something planned long before he arrived. As night slowly approached, the air grew colder than it should have been. The wind carried a low murmur that seemed almost like distant voices. Daniel tried to convince himself it was only the sound of grass moving together. He unpacked his bag near the center of the valley, where the ritual circle had to be drawn. The manuscript rested beside him, its worn pages fluttering softly in the cold air. Each symbol inside it felt heavier now that he stood in the place where it belonged. Using chalk and black ash, Daniel carefully began tracing the strange symbols across the soil. The circle grew wider with every line he drew, its shape forming a perfect boundary. When he finished the final mark, an unsettling silence fell across the valley. He placed 12 black candles around the circle exactly as the manuscript instructed. Their flames flickered weakly against the wind but never fully died. The light they produced seemed dimmer than ordinary fire. For a moment Daniel paused, staring across the darkening valley. The ground beneath his feet felt strangely hollow, like something buried far below the surface. A faint vibration moved through the soil before fading again. The sound of distant whispers returned, carried on the cold wind. They rose and fell, like a quiet chant spoken far beneath the earth. Daniel strained to listen, but the words were impossible to understand. A sudden shadow moved across the grass at the edge of the valley. Daniel turned quickly, shining his flashlight toward the darkness. Nothing stood there except empty land and restless wind. His heart pounded harder as the sky slowly turned black above him. Tonight was the exact moonless night the manuscript had described. Every condition for the ceremony had now been fulfilled. Daniel opened the manuscript to the page containing the forbidden chant. The candles around him burned quietly while the valley fell into unnatural silence. Somewhere beneath the ground, something seemed to be waiting for him to begin. The first word of the chant felt wrong the moment it left Daniel's lips. The sound echoed strangely across the empty valley, as if the darkness itself repeated the syllables. A cold shiver ran down his spine, but he forced himself to continue reading. The candles around the ritual circle flickered violently as the second line was spoken. Their flames stretched unnaturally tall before shrinking again into thin, trembling sparks. Daniel felt the air growing heavier with every word. The language of the chant twisted his tongue in ways no human language should. Each phrase felt ancient and sharp, scraping against the silence of the valley. Yet the manuscript demanded the chant be spoken without pause. The moment he reached the 7th line, the wind suddenly stopped. The tall grass that had been whispering all night fell completely still. The silence that followed felt unnatural and suffocating. Daniel's voice trembled slightly, but he continued the ritual. The manuscript warned that stopping halfway could be worse than finishing it. Something about that warning made his chest tighten with dread. As the chant continued, the ground inside the circle began to vibrate faintly. At first it felt like a distant tremor, subtle enough to question if it was real. But with every passing word, the shaking slowly grew stronger. A low, cracking sound echoed from beneath the soil. Daniel looked down just in time to see thin fractures spreading across the dirt inside the ritual circle. The ground was beginning to split open. Panic flashed through his mind for the first time since arriving in the valley. The manuscript had mentioned movement beneath the earth, but seeing it happen was something far worse. The soil shifted like something was pushing upward from below. The candles suddenly flared brighter, casting tall, distorted shadows across the grass. Those shadows twisted and stretched across the valley like living shapes. Daniel felt as though unseen figures now surrounded the ritual circle. The next line of the chant caused the ground to burst open with a violent crack. A skeletal hand shot through the soil, its fingers clawing desperately into the cold air. Daniel stumbled backward, staring in frozen disbelief. More cracks spread across the circle as the earth continued tearing apart. Another hand appeared, then another, each one reaching upward from the darkness below. The smell of rot and ancient dust filled the night air. Daniel's voice weakened as he reached the final lines of the ritual. All around him, the dead soil continued to break open as countless shapes began rising from beneath the valley. And in that terrifying moment, he realized the ceremony had never been meant to reveal knowledge. The figures rose from the earth like shadows given form. Their bodies were twisted, burned, and blackened, yet they moved with a terrifying precision. Daniel's mind struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. Centuries of death had come alive beneath his eyes. The soldiers' eyes glowed with an unnatural fire, burning like coals in the dark night. Their weapons, ancient and rusted, gleamed as if freshly forged in some infernal flame. The wind carried the faint scent of sulfur, mingling with the rotting earth they had clawed through. Daniel stumbled backward, tripping over the uneven ground as the first of them stepped fully into the moonless night. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, yet somehow coordinated. It was as if a single, unseen force controlled every motion, guiding them across the valley. The army was not silent. Low, guttural murmurs rose from their ranks, a chorus of voices from beyond the grave. Each whisper sounded like accusation, warning, and hunger all at once. The valley itself seemed to tremble beneath their collective presence. Daniel tried to run, but every step felt heavier, as if the soil itself resisted him. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the valley, merging and twisting like living tendrils. The more he looked, the more impossible it became to tell where one figure ended and the darkness began. A soldier raised its weapon and began marching toward him with deliberate intent. The others followed, forming a line that seemed endless. Daniel's heart pounded violently in his chest, each beat echoing like a drum of doom in the silent night. He realized then the terrifying truth. These were not mere corpses. It was something far older, bound by a force older than human memory. The manuscript's words replayed in his mind, the forgotten soldiers of the abyss. Daniel's flashlight flickered and died, leaving him in near-total darkness. Only the glow of the army's fiery eyes pierced the blackness. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, but his legs felt frozen, trapped by fear and the weight of impending doom. The army's march grew louder, the ground quaking beneath their feet. The valley seemed to expand unnaturally, swallowing the horizon in shadow. Daniel could hear his own shallow breaths, the only sound against the rising chorus of the damned. A skeletal figure stopped only a few feet away, tilting its head as if inspecting him. Its hollow eyes burned brighter, consuming the darkness around them. Daniel realized too late that the ritual had no guide, no mercy, and no plan beyond unleashing the dead. Panic surged, and he tried to speak, to call for help that would never come. But no words escaped, only a strangled gasp. The army, silent now except for the rhythm of their march, closed in, each step a countdown toward oblivion. Daniel knew in that instant the full weight of his mistake. He had not summoned knowledge, nor power, nor revelation. He had summoned Hell's army into the world of the living. And as the first of the cursed soldiers raised its weapon, the night swallowed him completely. Daniel's mind raced as he fell back into the ruined valley, trying to think of a way to undo the nightmare he had unleashed. The army of the damned spread across the battlefield like an unstoppable tide. Every shadowed corner seemed to breathe with their presence, making the world feel impossibly small. He scrambled toward the manuscript, desperate to find some forgotten instruction, some hidden safeguard. His hands shook as he flipped through pages, now torn and dirt-stained from the chaos. Every illustration of warriors clawing from the soil seemed to stare directly at him. A sudden movement to his left made him whirl around, flashlight useless in the darkness. Hundreds of glowing eyes reflected the faint starlight, tracking his every step. The whispers returned, louder now, like 1,000 voices chanting for him to join their ranks. Daniel forced himself to focus on the final pages of the book. There, in trembling letters, was the truth he had been avoiding. The ritual could only be undone with a sacrifice. Not just any sacrifice. The ritual demanded the soul of the one who completed it. A cold chill ran down his spine as he realized the implication. The army would not stop until he offered himself, the final piece needed to seal the gate. There was no running, no hiding, and no bargaining with forces older than humanity. The soldiers drew closer, their movements slow but deliberate, like a storm building toward its climax. Each step shook the ground beneath him, the valley itself groaning in response. He could hear bones scraping against earth and metal as their weapons clattered ominously. He sank to his knees, clutching the manuscript, trying to steady his shaking hands. The words on the page seemed to glow faintly, urging him to act before it was too late. Fear battled against instinct, but something deep inside told him there was no other way. With trembling resolve, Daniel recited the final incantation, this time willing his own life into the ritual. The wind howled violently, tearing through the valley as the ground quaked beneath him. The army froze in place, their fiery eyes flickering as if sensing the change. A searing light erupted from the ritual circle, blinding and pure, consuming the darkness around him. The soldiers shrieked, a sound that was both human and inhuman, echoing across the valley like a final lament. The ground cracked and heaved violently, dragging them back into the soil from which they had emerged. Daniel felt an unbearable pressure on his chest as he continued the chant. Pain seared through every nerve in his body, yet he forced the words forward. The manuscript burned faintly in his hands, as if the knowledge it contained was too powerful to remain in the world of the living. The final soldier vanished, leaving the valley eerily silent once more. The night air returned to normal, cold but empty, as if nothing had ever happened. Daniel collapsed to the ground, knowing the price had been paid, and that the army of the damned would no longer rise, at least for now. As he lay there, barely conscious, he understood the truth. Curiosity and obsession had brought him to the edge of oblivion. The valley remained quiet but haunted, a grave for countless souls. And Daniel, scarred in body and mind, knew that some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed.